of ordinary people. Now think about that for a moment. All of those who wish to be dictators in the Muslim world. The Prophet was acknowledged to get communication directly from God through angels, right? So the Prophet had contact with God. Everybody accepts this. If you don't accept this, you're not a Muslim. And yet Muslim people who accepted that the Prophet had advice from God, the Prophet would still speak to people to get their opinion. It doesn't mean that he followed their opinion all the time, but he still took their opinion. He still measured it on many matters relating to their daily lives. He still took advice from people like Abu Bakr and Uthman and Umar and Ali on many, many, many matters. He took advice from Salman the Farsi on how to dig ditches, for example, even though he was a Persian. And the Arabs and the Persians didn't particularly get along for large periods of history. So what we see in all of this, is that there was a sequence of events in the Prophet's life, moving from Mecca to Medina, a series of decisions that were taken. And the order of those decisions is incredibly important. Because the order of those decisions apply to us today, when we too, as Muslims, are weak, if not weaker, than the Muslims were in the time of the Quraysh and the time of so-called Jahiliyyah. And nobody talks about this order. And as a result, what we have when we discuss the Sunnah are hundreds of thousands of different narrations and pieces of advice and scholarly input and discussion, but no order, no beginning, no end to what you do first, what you do second, and what you do third. I like to say that Muslims major in minor things. So you can go and Muslims will tell you in the hadith about, the angle of the Prophet's toothbrush, and they will know this matter. But yet, they all put their money in a Western bank. And nobody has any idea what to do about that. They will talk endlessly about the tone of voice that a wife should use to her husband to protect his sensitivities, I suppose. But when millions of Muslims are slaughtered, often by their own so-called professional armies, and citizens have no rights to protect themselves in most of the Muslim world, everybody falls silent on this. We talk about education. We don't have people that are educated as to their rights, as to their duties, as to how to own property, how to generate income, how to have transferable skills, not just in terms of taking orders from other people, but how to manage their own wealth and share it for the betterment of the community. And then we're worried about, the exact form of tajweed that somebody uses. Again, I'm not belittling tajweed, it's important. I'm not belittling having an Islamic dress to distinguish yourself from non-Muslim people in terms of modesty. That's important. I'm not belittling how husbands and wives talk to each other. That's important. But the order of importance, just as icing is important to a cake, and eggs are important to a cake. You need all of them to make the cake. But the cake doesn't work unless the order is followed. And the reason why Rasulullah's life is so important to us is not just because of the magnificence of his character, but because of the order in which God helped guide him to make decisions which were important to taking us from wandering people in the desert to a civilization that's lasted for thousands of years. And so on the subject of leadership, what we have to do is we have to look to the prophetic example of how a society is created. And what we see in the life of Islam is that before there was a Muslim government, there was a Muslim society. There was a Muslim society where everybody in the society had an understanding of the goal of that society. The goal of that society was not to grab other people's money. It was not to eat, sleep, go to bed, and wake up the next day and just survive. It wasn't to drive wild animals out from their houses. The goal of that society was to bring everybody closer to God. And there were measurements of that society. How the poorest people in it were treated. How orphans and children and the weak were treated. How men and women were related to each other. When the Prophet came to the Arab people, they had one of the most brutal treatment of women ever imaginable. I mean, so did Europe and other places, but it was really terrible. People used to take their daughters, baby daughters, and bury them in the desert. Imagine that. baby daughter buried in the desert. It happened very typically. People could marry as many women as they wanted to. And they could even trap a woman by not divorcing her, but declaring them kind of like their mother. So the woman couldn't leave the man, and yet she couldn't have any of the rights of the wife. People inherited women. It was so bad that so if you were married to somebody at that time, and then you died, your brother could grab your wife. I mean, this was the situation of women in the time of the Prophet when he came. And into that society, he said, no, women have huge list of rights. He shocked the people of the time by saying that in a marriage, and listen up to this, brothers, this is authentic hadith and tradition from Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The wife has only two duties, not cooking and cleaning, all that sort of stuff. That's all charity. When a woman does that for a husband, that is charity. Wife's duty is to protect her faithfulness in marriage. That's her within the marriage. That's her primary duty to the husband. And as long as there is to obey God and follow God at all times, so the two primary aspects of it. All the other things that we make our mothers and sisters and daughters and other people do, these things are actually optional. They're actually voluntary. They're treated as sadaqah from the wife to the husband. And you would never know this today when you walk through Muslim societies, when we see the way that many of us treat the women in our societies. So what I'm saying to you is that when you look at the concept of leadership, you have to look at how the Prophet led. Most importantly, you have to look at the priorities that he had for people. The biggest individual priority was a system of measurement of the success of the society. And the system of measurement of the success of the society was how the people who were weakest in that society were doing. That was his first and overriding measurement. And how he solved the problem of how the weakest people were doing was by making sure that everybody individually, not by government order, but by spiritual faith, knew that they had an obligation to take what they had and give it to those who didn't. Whether it was education, whether it was wealth, whether it was protection. The Prophet took people that tried to kill Muslims in wars, and he said, you can go free if you are literate, provided you teach a Muslim how to read. Instead of just killing them or torturing them, which were all common practices at the time during war. You lost a war, that was bad news for you in ancient times. But instead of saying, okay, you lost the war, time to kill you, he said, if you were literate, make sure you teach at least one Muslim to read, and then you can go free. Transfer skills from people who had them to people who didn't. And by this kind of mercy, by this kind of understanding, he was revealing that it was more important to educate the society than to exact vengeance on behalf of the society. And I could go on, but within the Prophet's life, the history in which he did things, the order in which he did things, surprisingly, very few Muslims disagree on these matters. You can take Muslims from every so-called sect. So what did the Prophet do first? What did he do second? What did he do third? They all agree. And then the same people who just said, this is what he did first, this is what he did second, this is what he did third, argue about something that he might have done 99th when numbers 1 through 98 have not been done. And this is why we are where we are. We say we're Ahlul Sunnah. We say we follow the Sunnah, but we don't follow the order of the Sunnah. And what is then the point? Have we decided for ourselves that we know best how to implement these things? Well, we've had several hundred years of trying to do it another way. And how's that worked out for us? So when you look at the idea of should Muslims consult each other in forming a government, absolutely. What is the basis of that consultation? There is a scorecard. The Western scorecard values institutions in and of themselves. Western people get very excited about this idea of a constitution. Everything goes back to a constitution. You know, I always love how my American friends talk to me about Muslim fanaticism. I said, you really want to see fanaticism on display? Watch a couple of Americans talk about the Supreme Court and the Constitution. I mean, here you have a group of people several hundred years ago who kept slaves, who viewed women as property, who had disputes about what are now basic scientific facts. And yet, in 2012, what those people may or may not have meant, so-called the founder's intent, is the reason on which people sit here and say this or that law should be down. So we have to ask ourselves on the subject of leadership if we're interested in following the prophetic example. The most important aspect of this example is the sequence with which he did things. The most important part of the sequence is the intensive reliance on the formation of a society before there was the formation of the government. And this is the thing that many people miss, is what you call bottom-up. The bottom-up part of Islam was an intense focus on education and personal responsibility. The responsibility of a man to his family, the responsibility of a family to another family. There was a brotherhood of man created in an institution called the mosque. Before we had a government, we had a mosque. We did things in mosques that other people do through governments. And there's a reason for this. Because the mosque had rules that governments do not. In the mosque, the first person who comes into the mosque gets the number one position in line. In government, the guy who has the biggest paycheck is the one who comes to the front of the line. In the mosque, people are required to listen to each other, to conduct and respect all points of view. You can't physically fight or argue in a mosque. Government is frequently about the force, the guy who has the upper hand at that immediate moment. And so on and so forth. I give you thousands of differences between mosques and government. But within the mosque was the education of people in the society. Within the mosque was something else too, and that's knowledge of each other. We have turned mosques away from this function that they once had, which is a way for everybody in a community to know each other. You pray beside somebody, you can look and see, is he healthy? Is he hungry? Is he tired? More than usual. If you pray 5 times a day beside somebody, Allah willing, and you see that person for 365 days a year, by the second year of knowing him, you would know that person the way his own mother would know him. And if something is wrong, well before any government institution would ever find that out, you know. And if something is wrong with your brother, you care. And you ask, and you help. And when you organize a society on this basis, where people come to a mosque, and then there are many, many mosques, and mosques talk to each other, there are many things that today we ask the government to do that never have to be done by the government, because people's families or people's mosques do them well before the need arises. We don't need to pay as taxpayers to get someone to go talk to a psychologist, because if someone is sad, he has 50 people around him that actually want to help him. We don't necessarily need to resolve everything in a court, because if 2 brothers have a dispute and they're in the same mosque, it's the objective of the entire mosque to see that that dispute is solved, not that both brothers go bankrupt hitting each other over the head with lawyers. If there are problems between families, the community is organized in such a way within the mosque that there are many people, intermediaries, that can reach in between and solve problems between those families. As Rasulullah said, even in an authentic hadith, the people who mediate when there is a fight between members of a family and end that fight, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a special reward for them in paradise. And so we see then the way in which society was built up. It went from a collection of individuals to families, and families in mosques, and mosques connected to each other, and then from there, then formal institutions like a constitution, an army, shura, consultation, all of that came. Because if the people in a mosque have somebody they respect to speak for them, and then the other mosque has somebody who speaks for him, if you have 5 mosques and 1,000 people in each mosque, you have 5 people speaking for 5,000 people. And very quickly you have the Muslim version of a council. So Islam is not opposed to democracy. Islam is not opposed to consultation. Islam is not opposed to taking care of people. Islam is neither capitalistic nor communistic. But Islam was built in a way where there was a specific scorecard for seeing how well you were doing. And that scorecard comes from God.